Ever wonder how far you'd go if, say, someone in charge told you to do something you weren't really sure about?
It's a question a lot of us would rather not think about.
Well, buckle up, because today we're going deep on the Milgram experiment.
Milgram, a real classic, but man, talk about an ethics headache.
No kidding. This study really gets into the nitty-gritty of obedience, and let me tell you, it pushes some serious boundaries. We're going to unpack the whole thing, how it was set up, why it still sparks debate decades later, all of it.
We're talking about a study that really forces you to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature.
So for those who might not be familiar with it, let's start with the basics. What exactly was the Milgram experiment?
Okay, so imagine this. It's the 1960s. You sign up for a study at Yale, big deal university.
Very official, very legit.
Exactly. And they tell you it's about memory and learning. Simple enough, right?
Seems straightforward enough.
So you walk into a room, there's this guy in a lab coat, the researcher, and there's another volunteer there with you.
Okay, so pretty standard research study setup.
Except, and this is a big except, the other volunteer, the other participant, not actually a volunteer.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, they're in on it. They're an actor, part of the whole experiment.
Okay, this is already getting interesting. We've got this seemingly harmless learning experiment at a prestigious university, but there's some, shall we say, creative interpretation of the word volunteer going on. So what happens next?
Well, you, the real participant, you get assigned the role of the teacher.
And the actor?
The actor is the learner.
Okay, I'm picking up a little power dynamic already.
You better believe it. So they tell you your job is to basically quiz the learner. And every time they get an answer wrong, here's the kicker, you deliver an electric shock.
Hold on. Electric shock? Like for real?
For real.
Okay, I can already see why this thing is an ethics minefield.
Yeah, and we're just getting started.
This is the deep dive, and we're diving deep into the Milgram experiment today.
So these weren't like just static shocks. Yeah.
Oh, really? It gets worse.
Way worse. We're talking a whole panel, with switches and dials labeled with different voltages.
Okay, I'm picturing like one of those old Frankenstein movie setups.
Pretty much. It starts small, of course, but then it goes up and up all the way to 450 volts.
450 volts. I mean, that's got to be dangerous, right?
Oh, yeah. The machine even had warnings printed on it, like danger, severe shock.
And they expected people to actually use this thing on another person.
That was the whole point. The researcher, the guy in the lab coat, he was right there the whole time, urging the teacher on.
So, even if the participant had second thoughts, there's this authority figure pushing them to continue.
Exactly. They used phrases like, please continue, or the experiment requires that you continue, stuff like that.
Wow. Talk about pressure. So What did the participants do? I mean, did they actually follow through with these shocks?
Well, that's the really unsettling part.
Okay, to leave me hanging.
Most of them did.
Really? They kept shocking the other person, even knowing it could be causing serious pain.
That's right. Even when the learner started making mistakes on purpose, getting the answers wrong.
Which was all part of the setup.
Oh, yeah, totally. And it got intense. The actor would cry out in pain, plead with them to stop. At a certain point, they even went silent, like they were unconscious.
I can't even imagine being in that situation, knowing that you might be hurting someone, but still feeling like you had to keep going.
And that's exactly what Milgram was trying to understand, how far people would go when an authority figure told them to do something, even if it went against their own morals.
It's amazing how often this kind of thing pops up in history, right? Just regular people caught up in a system, following orders, even when it leads to terrible outcomes.
It's a disturbing reflection of human nature, isn't it?
It really is. So how in the world could a study like this ever be considered ethical? Did they at least tell the participants the truth afterward?
Well, that's the thing about the Milgram experiment, right? Even all these years later, the ethics are still being debated. They did debrief the participants, told them the shocks weren't real, that the learner was fine, but still.
Still, I bet the debriefing didn't erase the experience. To think you were capable of causing that much pain.
Exactly. Imagine the guilt, the anxiety, maybe even some trauma. Some participants were visibly shaken during the experiment, sweating, trembling, even laughing nervously.
And that was just during the experiment. It makes you wonder about the long-term effects. Did Milgram provide any psychological support afterwards?
He did debrief them, but nothing like what we'd consider ethical by today's standards. I mean, think about it.
Yeah, the research landscape has changed a lot since the 1960s. Nowadays, there'd be a lot more emphasis on informed consent, and protecting participants from potential harm.
Absolutely. You've got to balance the potential for groundbreaking research with the well-being of the people involved. It's a tough line to walk.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a tough one, right? How do you study something like obedience without kind of replicating the conditions that lead to it?
It's tricky, no doubt. If Milgram tried to pull this off today, I mean, any ethics board would be throwing the book at him.
I imagine. So, what would they change? What would a more ethical version of this experiment even look like?
Well, first and foremost, informed consent. Big time. Participants got to know what they're signing up for, the potential stress, the whole moral dilemma thing, all of it right out in the open.
Which I guess kind of throws a wrench in the whole experiment, right?
Yeah.
If you know it's about obedience, the shocks aren't even real.
Exactly. People might behave differently, knowing it's all a big show.
So how do you find that balance? How do you make it real enough to get those genuine responses, but without totally messing with people's heads? $1 million question right there. It's a constant debate in psychology, how to study these really complex social behaviors ethically. There are ways to minimize the deception, maybe using less extreme scenarios, providing tons of support throughout and after, but yeah, no easy answers.
But even with all the baggage, even with the ethical questions, we got to admit, the Milgram experiment, it still makes you think.
No doubt. It's a classic for a reason.
It is. So why does it matter today? Why are we still talking about this thing, almost 60 years later?
Because the stuff Milgram uncovered, it's not just some historical footnote. Those same forces, the power of authority, the way situations can influence us, it's all still very much in play.
Give me some examples. Where do we see this happening in the real world, right now?
Oh man, everywhere. Think about social media, right? The pressure to conform, to follow the crowd, even when it's blatantly unhealthy, or the workplace, how many people stay silent in the face of bad behavior because they're afraid to rock the boat. So what's the takeaway here? What can we actually learn from this, ethically questionable experiment from the past?
I think it's a wake-up call. A reminder that we all have a responsibility to think for ourselves, to question authority, and to, trust our gut when something feels off.
Yeah, to remember that we have a choice, even when the pressure's on, even when everyone else seems to be going along with it. Powerful stuff.
For sure. It's easy to judge those Milgram participants, but when you really break it down, it's a reminder that none of us are immune to these forces.
Definitely gives you some food for thought. Well, on that note, big thanks for diving into the Milgram experiment with us today. It's been enlightening, if a little unsettling.
You said it. It's not every day you get to unpack one of the most, shall we say, provocative studies in psychology.
And to all our listeners out there, keep those questions coming and keep exploring the world with a critical eye. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.